have you noticed how many people continue their lives exactly as before, yet feel a quiet unease they can no longer explain? Nothing dramatic has happened. No crisis forced the question. And still, something inside no longer fits. Beliefs that once felt solid now feel distant. Words that once carried meaning now sound repeated rather than lived. It is not doubt, it is displacement. We speak to you from within this moment. We are the Pleiadians. We do not arrive to replace what you believe, nor to challenge your faith. Our role has never been ideological. It has always been emotional and perceptual. Across civilizations, when belief systems reach their limit, the first signal is not intellectual collapse. It is emotional incoherence. People continue to believe the same things, yet feel less connected to them. They defend ideas they no longer experience. They protect structures that no longer nourish them. This is not failure. It is a threshold. Humanity is approaching a point where symbolic belief can no longer substitute lived coherence. And when this happens, something ancient begins to return to awareness. Not as a religion, not as a doctrine, but as a principle. What you are beginning to sense is the reemergence of what has been called, across many worlds and timelines, the cosmic Christ. This is not a figure of worship. It is not an identity bound to one culture or one era. It is a state of consciousness capable of inhabiting matter without fragmentation. Long before belief systems formed, before doctrines were written, before fear was used to maintain order, there existed a universal template of coherence, a way consciousness could move through emotion, body, and perception without breaking itself. On your world, this state was once embodied, not to be idolized, but to be demonstrated. What followed was not corruption out of malice. It was reduction through misunderstanding. A living state became a symbol, a demonstration became a story, and a universal principle became confined within structure. We are present now because this pattern is repeating, not only on Earth, but across multiple developing civilizations. Our function is not to reveal truth. Truth does not need revealing. Our function is to stabilize the emotional field while perception expands. Without stabilization, expansion leads to collapse. Without coherence, awakening becomes fragmentation. The cosmic Christ does not return as an individual arriving from elsewhere. It returns as a possibility re-entering awareness. Many of you feel this intuitively. You sense that something essential was lost, not destroyed. That the core was never wrong, only compressed. This compression is now loosening. And as it does, emotional sensitivity increases. Old beliefs begin to strain, and the need for external certainty gives way to inner alignment. This is where preparation begins. Not for contact in the skies, but for contact within perception. Before we continue, notice your internal response. Not agreement, not resistance, simply the feeling beneath the words. That feeling is where our work begins. When belief systems begin to fracture, the first instinct of the human mind is to repair the structure. It looks for better explanations, new interpretations, more refined theology, a more sophisticated language to preserve what once felt alive. But what is happening now cannot be repaired through thought. The discomfort spreading across humanity is not intellectual confusion. It is emotional misalignment. Many of you still believe the same things you were taught to believe, yet you no longer feel connected to them in the same way. The words remain familiar, but the inner resonance is gone. This is not rebellion, and it is not loss of faith. It is the exhaustion of a form that once served a purpose. Belief systems were never meant to carry consciousness indefinitely. They were temporary containers, structures designed to guide development until direct perception became possible. Over time, however, structure hardened. Meaning was replaced by repetition. Living experience was replaced by authority. When this happens, belief stops nourishing the inner world and begins to constrain it. This is the stage humanity has now entered. What collapses in moments like this is not truth, but representation. Truth does not disappear when structures fall. It becomes more difficult to hide from. The cosmic Christ was never intended to be represented through doctrine, hierarchy, or ritual. It was a demonstration of something far more subtle, that consciousness can inhabit the human condition without fragmenting itself. To live in this state does not require withdrawal from the world. It requires coherence within it. This coherence is not spiritual idealism. It is emotional integration. When emotion, perception, and responsibility align, the need for external certainty diminishes. Fear no longer governs meaning, and belief no longer substitutes experience. Across many civilizations, this moment appears the same. Old belief systems strain under the weight of expanded awareness. People attempt to preserve them through debate, through conflict, through identity-based opposition. But no argument can restore what has already completed its function. This is where instability often emerges. Without emotional guidance, the collapse of belief systems can lead to nihilism, resentment, or spiritual emptiness. Some cling harder, others reject everything. Neither response leads to integration. This is why our role becomes visible now. We work with the emotional field that surrounds belief, not with belief itself. Our function is to stabilize the inner transition, so that the collapse of old forms does not become psychological fragmentation. The cosmic Christ principle provides a reference point that does not demand loyalty or obedience. It does not ask you to abandon your past. It simply reveals what no longer resonates. Many of you already feel this revelation in subtle ways. You sense that certainty feels heavy, that rigid answers feel inadequate, that meaning now requires presence, not repetition. This is not confusion, it is maturation, and only when this is understood can the deeper layers of this transition be approached without fear. As belief systems begin to fracture, many people search for an external cause. They look to society, to institutions, to politics, to the loss of tradition. But the real fracture does not begin outside of you. It begins inside perception. When consciousness expands beyond the limits of a structure, that structure stops feeling protective. It begins to feel restrictive. What once carried meaning now feels narrow. What once guided now feels repetitive. Not because it was wrong, but because it can no longer contain what is awakening within you. This is what is unfolding within modern Christianity. Not the collapse of truth, but the saturation of form. The original essence was never meant to become a permanent container. It was meant to activate an inner capacity and then release its hold. Across civilizations, this pattern repeats with precision. A living insight becomes a teaching becomes a system becomes identity, and identity slowly replaces direct experience. When belief becomes identity, it stops pointing inward and begins to demand protection. This is where emotional tension emerges, because something within you already knows. That meaning cannot be defended. It must be lived. What many are feeling now is not the loss of Christ consciousness, but the quiet realization that no structure can own it. This realization exposes the emotional field. Certainty no longer calms. Repetition no longer reassures. Inherited answers no longer stabilize the inner movement that has begun. Some feel grief. Some feel resistance. Some feel relief mixed with guilt. All of these responses indicate the same shift. Inner authority is moving back where it belongs. The cosmic Christ does not stand against Christianity. It dissolves the illusion that consciousness can be mediated indefinitely through structure. When intermediaries fall away, nothing absorbs emotional tension for you anymore. Nothing interprets experience on your behalf. And coherence becomes a personal responsibility. This is a delicate phase. What remains unnamed continues to act silently within the emotional field. What is not acknowledged keeps pulling from beneath awareness. Before we continue, write this sentence in the comments. A belief I carry no longer feels alive within me. Writing this allows what is already dissolving inside you to be acknowledged. When something is named, it stops working in silence, and the emotional field begins to stabilize. This act is not for explanation. It is not for discussion. It is a moment of alignment. From this stability, the next layer of understanding can unfold without resistance. To understand what is happening now, it becomes necessary to separate two layers that were long treated as one: the historical figure and the universal principle. What most of humanity was taught to relate to was a person, a story, a timeline, a narrative of suffering and redemption. What was largely lost in that transmission was the state of consciousness being demonstrated. The one known as Christ did not arrive to be followed. He arrived to show what was possible: a human nervous system capable of sustaining expanded perception, without fear, without fragmentation, without collapse. This was not meant to become mythology. It was meant to become replicable, but replication requires emotional maturity, and humanity at that stage was not prepared for it. So the demonstration was reduced into symbolism. The state was compressed into narrative, and over time, the narrative replaced the experience. This is how the Christ principle became externalized. Once externalized, could be managed, interpreted, controlled. Fear entered where coherence once existed. Obedience replaced alignment, and salvation was projected outward, instead of recognized as an internal process of integration. The cosmic Christ refers to what existed before this reduction, and what continues to exist beyond it. It is not bound to one body, one century, or one planet. It is a universal pattern of consciousness that appears whenever a civilization approaches a threshold between symbolic belief and lived coherence. In simple terms, the cosmic Christ is the capacity to remain whole while perception expands, to feel deeply without becoming reactive, to perceive broadly without losing grounding, to act responsibly without fragmenting internally. This is not ascension. It is integration. The tragedy of the historical distortion was not that Christ was misunderstood, but that humanity learned to wait, instead of learning to embody. Waiting postpones responsibility. Embodiment demands it. This is why the return of the cosmic Christ does not come as another figure, another teacher, or another savior. It comes as a pressure from within, a pressure to reconcile emotion and perception, a pressure to live without intermediaries, a pressure to stabilize consciousness. In the absence of inherited certainty, this pressure is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. You can no longer attribute incoherence to belief alone. You can no longer outsource meaning, and you can no longer hide behind tradition. When inner alignment is missing, the cosmic Christ does not judge this moment. it responds to it. When structures can no longer carry consciousness, consciousness must learn to carry itself. This is the transition now unfolding. And it is not happening to humanity. It is happening within humanity. When a civilization reaches the limits of symbolic belief, the same question emerges again and again, even if it is never spoken aloud. Is what we are experiencing unique, or is it part of a larger pattern? From our perspective, the answer is clear. The principle you are now encountering has never been exclusive to Earth. The cosmic Christ is not a historical exception. It is a recurring universal pattern that appears whenever consciousness matures beyond containment. Across many worlds, development follows a similar arc. First, perception expands. Then meaning is translated into language. Language becomes teaching. Teaching becomes structure. And structure eventually replaces direct experience. For a time, this creates stability. But stability built on representation has a limit. When that limit is reached, consciousness begins to press outward, not violently, but persistently. This pressure does not announce itself as revelation. It appears as dissatisfaction, as inner fatigue, as the sense that something essential has been reduced or misplaced. At this stage, civilizations face a choice. They can attempt to preserve belief systems indefinitely, tightening control, reinforcing identity, and resisting change. Or they can allow meaning to return to its source, direct coherence within the individual. The cosmic Christ emerges precisely at this junction, not as a being descending from above, but as a state of integration becoming accessible. On other worlds, this principle was never personalized. It was understood as a phase of development, the point at which emotional regulation, ethical responsibility, and expanded perception converge. On Earth, this convergence was embodied once, at a time when humanity was not yet capable of sustaining it collectively. What followed was inevitable. The embodiment was isolated. The state was externalized, and the principle was mythologized. But the principle itself was never lost. It remained latent, waiting for the emotional maturity required to support it without distortion. This is why it returns now, not because history is repeating, but because conditions are aligning. Your world is more interconnected. Your emotional awareness is expanding. Your capacity to perceive contradiction is increasing. And yet, your systems of belief remain largely symbolic. This gap creates tension. The cosmic Christ does not arrive to resolve this tension for you. It arrives to make it conscious. When a civilization recognizes that coherence must be lived, not believed, a new phase of development begins. This phase does not remove spirituality. It grounds it. It does not eliminate meaning. It internalizes it. And it does not replace faith. It transforms faith from dependence into alignment. What you are experiencing now is not an anomaly. It is not a deviation. It is a familiar stage in the maturation of conscious species. The difference is not what is happening, but how prepared you are to face it without fragmentation. This is why emotional stabilization remains central to everything that follows. Without it, expanded perception overwhelms. With it, coherence becomes sustainable. And from that coherence, entirely new forms of relationship with each other, with other civilizations, and with consciousness itself become possible. As the cosmic Christ principle becomes perceptible again, it is essential to understand why our presence intensifies during phases like this, and why our role cannot be replaced by information, belief, or instruction. We do not embody the cosmic Christ. We do not represent it, and we do not ask you to follow it. Our function is more precise. We prepare the emotional field required for such a state of consciousness to become sustainable. Across many civilizations, the same pattern appears when belief systems dissolve. Perception expands faster than emotional regulation. Sensitivity increases before coherence is established. When this happens, awareness does not bring peace. It brings overload. People begin to feel more, but without knowing how to hold what they feel. They perceive more, but without stability to integrate perception. This is where fragmentation begins. Many civilizations mistake this phase for awakening, only to collapse under the weight of unmanaged sensitivity. Insight turns into agitation, compassion turns into exhaustion, and expanded perception becomes anxiety. This is why emotional coherence must precede contact, not follow it. The cosmic Christ represents an integrated state of consciousness, one in which emotion, perception, and responsibility remain aligned, even under expanded awareness. But no consciousness can inhabit that state. Inside a nervous system still structured around fear, defense, or inherited certainty. This is where our work begins. We work with the heart field because it is the first system to destabilize. When old belief structures no longer absorb emotional tension. When belief collapses, emotion is exposed. And when emotion is exposed without guidance, the individual seeks substitutes, new ideologies, new identities, new projections. This creates repetition rather than evolution. Our role is not to soften this process artificially. It is to stabilize it without suppression. We assist you in learning how to remain present with emotional intensity, without reacting, withdrawing, or externalizing meaning. This is not spiritual training. It is emotional maturity. The cosmic Christ does not arrive to rescue humanity from this process. It can only be embodied after this process has been integrated. That is why preparation matters. Not preparation through belief, not preparation through expectation, but preparation through inner alignment. Many of you already feel this pressure internally. A pressure to stop dividing what you feel from what you believe. A pressure to stop repeating answers that no longer regulate your emotional state. A pressure to become internally consistent. This pressure is not imposed by us. It is generated by your own expanding perception. And before this expansion can continue safely, a conscious act of emotional permission is required. Before we continue, write this sentence in the comments. I am allowing emotional coherence to replace inherited certainty. Writing this is not symbolic. It signals to your emotional field that defense is no longer required. When certainty loosens, coherence gains space to organize itself naturally. This reduces internal resistance and allows the integration process to continue without overwhelming the nervous system. Only from this stabilized ground can the next phase of understanding unfold, without fear, projection, or collapse. As emotional coherence begins to replace inherited certainty, many people notice a subtle shift in how reality is experienced. Not brighter, not more mystical, but more honest. What collapses first in this phase is not belief itself, but the habit of using belief to avoid inner responsibility. For a long time, systems carried meaning for you. They interpreted experience. They explained suffering. They absorbed uncertainty. When those systems weaken, life feels more exposed. There is less buffer between perception and emotion, less distance between what you sense and how it affects you. This exposure can feel unsettling, but it is also the beginning of maturity. Civilizations do not evolve by accumulating more answers. They evolve by developing the capacity to remain stable in the presence of unanswered questions. This is one of the least understood aspects of the cosmic Christ principle. It is not about transcendence. It is about remaining integrated while not knowing. To live without certainty and without fragmentation is a skill that must be learned. On many worlds, this phase determines whether development continues or regresses into control and ideology. When uncertainty becomes intolerable, structures tighten, authority becomes rigid, and belief hardens into identity. This is how spiritual systems turn into mechanisms of fear. But when uncertainty is tolerated emotionally, something else becomes possible. Curiosity replaces defense, presence replaces explanation, and meaning begins to arise from direct coherence, rather than inherited narrative. This is why emotional maturity is not optional in this transition. Without it, expanded perception destabilizes. With it, awareness deepens without breaking the self. The cosmic Christ does not provide answers to uncertainty. It demonstrates how to live without being governed by it. This distinction changes everything. It shifts development away from external authority and back toward internal alignment. Many of you are already practicing this without naming it. You notice that some beliefs no longer regulate your emotional state. You feel that repeating certain words no longer brings peace. And you sense that alignment now requires presence, not affirmation. This is not loss. It is refinement. As this refinement continues, relationships change, expectations soften, and the need to convince others gradually fades. This prepares the ground for something essential, not agreement, not unity of belief, but compatibility of emotional fields. Only when individuals can remain coherent in uncertainty does coexistence, human or interstellar, become viable. This is the stage you are entering now, and it is not dramatic. It is quiet. It unfolds in daily perception, in how you listen, in how you respond, in how you remain present without retreating into certainty. This quiet stability is the true foundation of what comes next. As emotional coherence deepens, another layer of understanding begins to emerge naturally. The question is no longer about belief. It becomes a question of compatibility. When consciousness stabilizes within uncertainty, it becomes capable of recognizing difference without needing to defend itself. This is where the broader context of cosmic interaction becomes relevant. Many civilizations exist, many levels of development coexist, and many forms of intelligence operate across different principles. Not all civilizations work with emotion in the same way. Not all understand the heart field as central to integration. And not all prioritize emotional coherence as a prerequisite for contact. This is why preparation matters. Contact is not determined by technology. It is determined by inner stability. A species may be intellectually advanced and emotionally fragmented at the same time. In such cases, contact intensifies division rather than growth. Across civilizations, this has been observed repeatedly. When contact occurs without emotional preparation, projection dominates perception, fear amplifies difference, and misunderstanding escalates into conflict. This is why cooperation between civilizations is never based on belief alignment, but on emotional compatibility. The cosmic Christ principle represents the level of internal integration required for conscious coexistence beyond one's own species. It does not impose values. It does not unify cultures. It establishes a baseline of coherence. that allows difference to exist without destabilization. From this perspective, the presence of multiple civilizations is not a future event. It is a relational condition. As emotional coherence stabilizes within individuals, the collective field becomes less reactive, less defensive, less prone to mythologizing the unknown. This is why many of you feel a shift in how the idea of contact is perceived. Less fascination, less fear, more sobriety. This sobriety is not indifference. It is readiness. When imagination quiets, perception sharpens, and when emotional projection diminishes, reality becomes easier to meet without distortion. The cosmic Christ does not announce contact. It prepares the inner conditions, under which contact no longer overwhelms. This preparation is subtle. It unfolds through daily emotional regulation, through responsibility in perception, through the capacity to remain present with difference. As this continues, the idea of other civilizations loses its dramatic charge. Difference becomes informational rather than threatening. Presence becomes more important than explanation. This is how coexistence begins, not with revelation, not with spectacle, but with inner stability that no longer needs the unknown to be either worshipped or feared. This is the quiet groundwork being laid now, and it is far more consequential than any external sign could ever be. As the idea of contact loses its dramatic charge, a deeper and more decisive movement begins to surface. Not the anticipation of an event, but the recognition of a threshold within perception. Contact does not begin with appearance. It begins with the way difference is held internally. When the emotional field is unstable, the unknown is immediately polarized. It becomes either threat or promise. Fear and fascination arise from the same imbalance. Both override perception. This is why the cosmic Christ principle does not prepare you for spectacle. It prepares you for relationship. A relationship with what does not mirror you. With intelligence that does not reassure identity. With perspectives that cannot be absorbed into existing narratives. Without emotional coherence, difference feels invasive. With coherence, difference becomes informational. This distinction determines whether contact destabilizes or simply expands understanding. Many civilizations never reach this stage. They seek contact as validation, as rescue, as confirmation that they are not alone. In doing so, they project unresolved tension outward, and contact amplifies fragmentation rather than resolving it. The cosmic Christ represents the moment, when consciousness no longer needs external confirmation to remain whole. When meaning is internalized, presence becomes sufficient. This sufficiency changes how the unknown is approached. Urgency dissolves, interpretation slows, and imagination no longer overrides perception. You may notice this shift quietly taking place. A reduced need to label, a softening of emotional reactivity, a growing capacity to remain present without immediately defining what is encountered. This is not detachment. It is regulation. Regulation allows perception to operate without defense. And when defense subsides, projection loses its force. This is the state from which coexistence becomes possible. Not coexistence based on agreement, but coexistence grounded in emotional compatibility. Contact that emerges from this state does not overwhelm the nervous system. It does not demand belief, and it does not destabilize identity. It simply adds information. This is why preparation unfolds internally first. Before this transition can continue without distortion, one specific internal adjustment must be acknowledged. Before we continue, write this sentence in the comments. I allow difference to exist without needing to define or control it. Writing this is not symbolic. It signals to the emotional field that vigilance can relax. When the need to control dissolves, perception becomes clearer, and interaction no longer triggers defensive patterns. This declaration reduces inner friction and allows readiness to replace expectation. From this stabilized position, the final phases of this transition can unfold without fear, projection, or collapse. Once readiness replaces expectation, a different understanding of transformation becomes possible. Up to this point, many spiritual frameworks describe change as something that happens away from ordinary life, ascension, transcendence, escape from limitation. But the cosmic Christ principle does not operate through departure. It operates through integration. Integration means nothing is left behind. The body is not bypassed. Emotion is not denied. And responsibility is not postponed. Expanded consciousness does not lift you out of daily reality. It deepens your relationship with it. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of this transition. Many expect transformation to feel extraordinary, to feel elevated, to feel removed from the ordinary rhythms of human life. But coherence does not create distance, it creates clarity. As perception expands, you become more aware of subtle inconsistencies between what you say and what you feel, between what you believe and how you act, between intention and impact. This awareness is not judgment. It is calibration. The cosmic Christ does not erase human complexity. It brings it into alignment. This alignment often feels quieter than expected. Less emotional volatility, less internal contradiction, less need to perform identity. Daily life does not disappear. It becomes more transparent. This transparency changes how responsibility is experienced. Responsibility no longer feels imposed from outside. It arises naturally from clarity. You act differently not because you must, but because incoherence becomes uncomfortable. This discomfort is not punishment. It is feedback. On many worlds, this stage marks a profound shift. Ethics are no longer enforced through rules. They emerge from perception. Care for others is no longer moral obligation. It becomes a consequence of emotional attunement. The cosmic Christ state expresses itself, not through extraordinary acts, but through consistent presence, through the ability to remain regulated, in complexity, in ambiguity, and in difference. This is why the transition feels subtle. Nothing dramatic announces it. No external authority confirms it, and no belief system validates it. Its evidence appears in how you listen, how you respond, how you remain present when certainty is unavailable. This stage cannot be rushed. Integration unfolds at the pace. Your emotional system can sustain. When forced, it fragments. When allowed, it stabilizes. The cosmic Christ does not demand readiness. It responds to it, and readiness expresses itself, not through belief, but through the capacity to live coherently within ordinary reality, without needing escape. This is the foundation upon which everything that follows must rest. Without it, expansion destabilizes. With it, perception deepens without rupture. This is the work now unfolding, quietly, consistently, and from within. As integration deepens, a final misunderstanding begins to dissolve. For a long time, the Christ state was associated with a single individual, a unique exception, something to be revered rather than approached. But the cosmic Christ was never meant to remain singular. It was an early demonstration of what a human consciousness can sustain once emotional coherence becomes stable. This is why the idea of return has been misunderstood. The cosmic Christ does not return as a person. It returns as a capacity that becomes accessible when a civilization reaches sufficient emotional maturity to hold expanded perception without collapse. This is the threshold humanity is now approaching, not because humanity has become perfect, but because fragmentation is becoming visible enough to no longer be denied. When fragmentation is unconscious, it governs behavior silently. When it becomes conscious, integration becomes possible. This is how collective transitions begin, not through agreement, not through uniform belief, but through a growing number of individuals who can remain internally coherent without relying on inherited certainty. These individuals do not stand out dramatically. They do not seek influence, and they do not attempt to convert others. Their presence is quiet. They listen more than they argue. They respond rather than react. And they no longer need to defend identity in order to feel stable. This is how the Christ state spreads, not by multiplication of followers, but by resonance. Resonance does not require persuasion. It operates through emotional compatibility. When coherence is lived, it subtly reorganizes the surrounding field. Others feel calmer in its presence. Conflict de-escalates, and interaction becomes less charged. This is not charisma, it is regulation. On many worlds, this stage marks the transition from symbolic spirituality to lived coherence. The Christ state becomes a collective possibility, not a historical anomaly. It does not require belief to function. It requires capacity to feel without overwhelm, capacity to perceive without projection, capacity to act without fragmentation. This is why preparation has taken the form it has. Belief systems had to weaken so that responsibility could return inward. Certainty had to loosen so that perception could stabilize. And authority had to decentralize so that coherence could emerge organically. The cosmic Christ does not belong to the past, and it does not wait in the future. It becomes present whenever enough individuals can sustain alignment without needing protection from difference. This is not an end state. It is a beginning that unfolds quietly, without spectacle, and without interruption of ordinary life. And as this capacity stabilizes across individuals, the collective field changes in ways that cannot be enforced, only lived. This is the deeper meaning of return, not arrival, not intervention, but availability, and it is already underway. As we reach the end of this transmission, it becomes important to understand what has truly been described here. Not a belief system, not a prophecy, not a replacement for what once guided you. What has been outlined is a shift in responsibility. For a long time, meaning was carried externally. Structures interpreted reality. Belief absorbed uncertainty. And identity provided protection from inner fragmentation. That phase is ending, not because it failed, but because it completed its function. The cosmic Christ does not mark the collapse of faith. It marks the return of coherence to the individual. This is why the transition feels quiet. There is no spectacle, no dramatic revelation, no authority declaring what is true. Instead, there is a subtle internal movement, a growing inability to live in contradiction, a discomfort with borrowed certainty, a need for alignment that cannot be postponed. This movement does not make you special. It makes you responsible. Responsible for how you regulate emotion, for how you relate to difference, for how you act when certainty is unavailable. This is the true preparation taking place. Not preparation for rescue, not preparation for salvation, but preparation for coexistence. Coexistence with other humans, with other intelligences, and with expanded perception itself. The cosmic Christ is not something you follow. It is something that becomes possible when fragmentation no longer governs behavior. When enough individuals reach this state, the collective field reorganizes naturally, not through agreement, but through compatibility. This compatibility does not erase difference. It allows difference to exist without destabilizing the whole. This is the foundation of all future contact, human or interstellar, and it begins here. Before we close, write this sentence in the comments. I choose coherence over inherited certainty. Writing this is not symbolic. It marks a moment of internal commitment. When coherence is chosen consciously, the emotional field begins to reorganize around stability, rather than defense. This declaration anchors what has already been activated, allowing the transition to continue, without retreat or fragmentation. We will continue to remain present as this process unfolds, not to guide belief, but to support emotional stabilization. As humanity learns to carry expanded awareness without losing itself, this is not an ending. It is the point from which coherence becomes lived reality.